Okay, for this presentation, I'd like to continue in Unit 3 in Input and Output Management, where we've been examining the java.io package, looking at that API. So we last left off introducing the file class, and then we looked at various ways we could create a file. I'm going to continue along that pathway and just examine all of the different ways we could read a file. So a quick overview for this presentation is I'm going to give an introduction on reading files, and then we'll look at the various ways where we could read a file using the buffered input stream, which we've seen before when talking about streams. We'll look at reading a file line by line using the BufferedReader class. So that's used for reading character streams, whereas input streams are our byte streams. We'll look at reading a text file using the scanner class. We'll look at reading a text file using the FileReader class. And we'll look at using reading a file using the files class. So some of these we've seen before, some of these we've used before, but haven't used to open up files like scanner. And some of these we haven't seen before, like using the files class. So a quick introduction in this lecture, we'll learn how to read data or text of a file using various classes in Java. There are several ways to read a text file in Java. By using the following classes, we can read data from any text file in Java easily. So again, the buffered input stream is a class we've seen. BufferedReader is a class we've seen. Scanner class you used last semester, right? But we'll see how we can use that to actually read a text file. FileReader we've seen before, but we're going to bundle all these approaches together so you know what strategies you have available into one concise lecture. We'll look at reading the entire file list using the read all lines method of files. So that's going to be the way we can do that. And we'll take an example. We'll look at an example of that. And then also we can read a text file as string. So we'll understand these ways to read data from the following programs. So first, let's talk about reading a text file using the buffered input stream. So recall that the buffered input stream in Java is a concrete subclass of the filter input stream. Remember, the filter input stream, that's anything that uses that decorator pattern, anything where we have one input stream that relies on giving additional functionality to a pre-existing stream. Well, the buffered input stream is an input stream that maintains an in-memory buffer, so we don't have to read a character byte at a time through the OS. So instead, it has this in-memory bucket, a buffer, that it just loads a number of characters or bytes into, and then as we request to read, it pulls from our in-memory storage as opposed to having to access the file each time. Way more efficient and more performative. So that's what you should always, you should target for using buffered input and output streams for that reason. Anyway, yeah, it wraps a buffer around an input stream into a buffered stream and makes read operations on the stream more efficient and fast. In other words, buffered input stream adds buffering capabilities. Yep, I just mentioned that. And so it temporarily stores all of the bytes from the file in that memory buffer and then allows us to read them into our stream as we need them. It adds an additional layer of functionality around some underlining stream. And that's why, again, it is a subclass the filter input stream, because that's the one property that the filtered input stream is trying to convey. And then all the subclasses do that in novel and interesting ways. Okay, so let's create a simple program. Let's actually do a sample program where we will read the contents of a file, read file1.txt line by line using the buffered input stream class. So here is our Java code for that, but I always like to go to IntelliJ. So this is my read file tester 1. This is the first way that we're going to examine reading a file, and I think this is the first way we ever learned how to read a file. So let's go to our read file tester 1 inside of IntelliJ. So here, let's go ahead and explain. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit run so we can look at the source code while we're talking about what's happening in the actual code here. So here, I'm going to also read file1.txt. Perfect. So I'm going to import my buffered input stream because that's the approach we're looking at to read a file. And then I'm also going to import the file input stream because buffered input stream requires some pre-existing input stream, and it adds those buffering capabilities on top of it. And then since we're dealing with input and output, we need to import our IO exception. So here we're going to create a class that can have a main method so we can actually play around with our code. And here, my main method, I'm just going to have through the IO exception so we don't have to do a try catch block. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file input instance. So we're going to call that constructor file input stream. We're going to pass it in the pathway, the file name along with its path towards the file we want to read. And so that's going to be read file1.txt. That's inside of my source directory, my src directory. And if I open that up, I can see, oh, here I have this text hello from a file. Okay. So we're going to attach a file input stream onto that file. And then we're going to take that file input stream and we're going to pass that into the constructor of a buffered input stream constructor. And we're going to build a buffered input stream around that. And then we're going to use the buffered input stream to make all of our reads. And so here we'll just go ahead and have a loop control variable. We'll set it to 0. Then we're going to do a while loop. And here we're going to read a byte at a time, because this is an input stream. So this reads bytes and it returns the byte in the form of an integer. So long as the sentinel value isn't -1, because that represents an end of file, so long as that isn't -1, we'll continually read the next set of bytes from the file until our stream runs out of bytes. And here we'll cast the integer that we get, that we are saving into I from this read method. And we're going to cast it as a character, and then we're going to print that character. And then when we're done, we're going to go ahead and close our input streams. And we could see what we get from this while loop is going to be the result of this, hello from a file. So this is an example, one example of many on how we can go ahead and read the contents of a file, the text from a file, a byte at a time. But we're not doing it a byte at a time from the file. We're loading all those bytes into the buffered memory, and then we're grabbing it from the buffer a byte at a time from there. And that makes a much more performative implementation for this approach, as opposed to just using the file input stream directly. Excellent. So then our output was hello from a file. We already went through the explanation. Excellent. Okay, so let's look at an alternate approach. Let's read the text file line by line using BufferedReader. Now remember, anything that's reader writer is designed to operate on character streams and not byte streams. And character streams sit on top of byte streams. Byte streams are like the most elemental of our streams. And then character streams fit on top of a byte stream, and they do all the internal processing of converting the bytes into characters, into text for us. So we don't have to do that conversion. So the buffered reader in Java is a buffering input character stream. So again, it buffers just like the buffered input stream does, but it treats the fundamental units inside the stream as characters as opposed to bytes. And so it's used to read text from the buffer rather than the bytes directly. So we use those for text sources. But again, it's more performative if we use, it's more efficient if we use the buffered reader as opposed to just like the file reader. But it requires something like a file reader, right, in order to give those additional buffered capabilities on top of it. So it adds the buffering capability to the underlying input character stream so that there is no need to access the underlying file system for each read and write operation. So the buffered reader is a subclass of the reader class that extends the object class, and it implements closable, auto-closable, readable, all the things that we've talked about before. We want to look at examples here, though. We won't dive into that too much. So let's just do a sample program. Let's create a Java program in which we read the text of a line, of a full line, from an existing file and display it to the console. So here's going to be the implementation, super simple. let's actually jump into IntelliJ, FileReader Tester 2. So I'm going to go to FileReader Tester 2 here. And we're going to read this file, read file 2. And so here we can see inside read file 2, it's a multi-line file, right? First line, second line, third line, fourth line, 4 different lines. And we want to read a line at a time, as opposed to a byte at a time, which we did in the last example. So let's take a look at the source code. I'm going to import BufferedReader, and then I'm going to import FileReader because my BufferedReader requires an underlining reader to go ahead and implement on top of to add the buffered functionality. I'm also going to import IO exception because we're working with IO stuff. I'm going to create a tester, like an example class here, so we can have main method. So my main method, I'm going to throw the IO exception. Okay, let's define a file path. So in this instance, I want to use the file. I'm going to read the file that's inside my source directory at readfile2.txt. We just looked at it. So I'm going to, as a string, save the relative path, because I'm using that // So from this current directory, which is my lecture 23 files directory, I have a src directory. This directory inside there is this readfile2.txt. Excellent. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and invoke the constructor for FileReader. I'm going to pass it that file path, and I'm going to create an instance of a FileReader. And then I'm going to wrap around that FileReader this BufferedReader. I'm going to create a new instance of BufferedReader. I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to use the BufferedReader to make all of my calls to read the file. So here I'm going to create a local variable of a string, which is going to represent the line of text, a line at a time. So I have 4 lines of text where my delimiter is the new line character effectively. And then what I'm going to do is, so the BufferedReader has a method called readLine, where it'll read everything inside of the stream up to a new line character and then return that. So I will save the returned value of that into this string variable line of text. And we're going to continue to do that until a call to read line returns a null reference, until it doesn't return a string anymore. And that's my break condition that represents an end of file for me. And so then I'll just do a print ln on the line of text. And if I go and run that, since we're talking about that, we can see we do that 4 different times where we grab everything up to the new line character from our input stream for the first line, and then again for the second line, then again for the third line, and then finally for the 4th line. And then after that, we return null, and there's nothing more to read from the file. So this just represents another way we can go ahead and read a file. The other way used a byte stream. We're reading a byte at a time from our buffered input stream. This way, we were able to read a full line at a time, all the way to a new line character using the BufferedReader class. Again, that's the output that we got, and it's congruent to what we expected. Okay, let's look at another approach. We said that there was a multitude of approaches, and we're consolidating them all in this one presentation. So let's try to read a text file using the scanner class. Now, you're well acquainted with the scanner class because we use that a lot to scan our input streams from the keyboard in the prior Java class. Here, scanner in Java is a predefined class that reads or scans the data dynamically from the keyboard or a text file. In other words, the scanner class allows the user to read all the types of numeric values, strings, and other types of data in Java where it comes from a disk file or a keyboard or some other source. So it's the fastest and easiest way to receive the input from the user in Java, as opposed to using our input stream reader or a buffered reader. Because it allows us to, I mean, we've already done it from the keyboard. You see how you can cast data from your scanner and parse it as a double or as a Boolean or as a string. Okay, so why don't we take a look at a simple example program where we read data from a file using the scanner class. And again, here's my my Java code, but I want to jump to my IntelliJ read file tester 3. This is the 3rd example on how we can read a file. So let me open this up, close that older one. So read file tester 3. So before I start going through that, let's just see what we have inside of here. So it looks like I have two different, so I have a name, John T. Smith, and I have a number 50, and then I have another name, Eric K. Smith 45. Well, a name and then the number 45. So I have two lines. Okay, so let's see what we have here. I'm going to import the file class. I'm going to import the input output, the IO exception, and I'm going to import scanner. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a example class file, right? So I can have a main method. My main method's just going to throw my IO exception. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the file path for this file here, the read file 3.txt, and I'm going to build a new file instance to represent that file inside of my Java code. And I'm going to save that into a file object. And then I'm going to pass that file object to a new instance of scanner. So previously we were using an system.in, right? We're using an input stream that was looking at the keyboard, but that's not the only thing. We could pass strings to scanner, and then we could parse that string as if it were a stream, or we can pass a file object into the scanner, and then we can parse, then the scanner is attached to that file, and it can read from that file the same way it could read from system.in, or the same way it could read from a string. And so we're going to save a reference to that scanner, and then we're going to do, well, we're going to check while scanner has some next token, some next element inside of its stream. So as long as it has another thing, we will get that thing. And so next we'll return the string value, right? And you delimit it by either a space or a tab or a new line character. We're going to save that into a local variable called first name. Then we're going to grab the middle name, right? We're going to call scanner.next, and then we're going to do scanner.next again to get the last name. So recall that that's first name, middle name, last name. And then finally, we're going to grab the age. So that's an int, next int. So it allows us to take this text and cast it into the data that we want to parse it as. And then we're going to just print all that out, the first name, the middle name, the last name, and the age. And if I run this, and we'll do that until we run out of elements that we can grab, and then we'll close our stream. We always want to close our stream. And here we're going to close, we're going to tell the scanner to close the stream that it's looking at. And here we see as our output, in our console, it's the same thing we're able to read off the file. So this is just a quick example of how we can use the scanner class to also read the contents of a file. Something new and novel we haven't done, and how powerful it is because we get access to all of the built-in methods that scanner has. So it's a very easy way to go ahead and read a file. We can read the text file using FileReader class. Now, this isn't too different than what we had done before, right? But now the reader class isn't going to be as efficient as the BufferedReader, because we'll have to do a read for each character at a time, each time we do a read, but it is still a valid way of reading a file in. So again, the FileReader is in Java is an input stream that reads data in the form of characters. Anything that is appended with either reader or writer works on character-based input streams. I don't really care about the subclasses. We already talked about that. Let's just look at reading the entire contents of a file using the files class. Yeah, because we've seen this already. With buffered, we just wouldn't pass the buffer. We would do the same thing with reader, but it's the less performant way. Okay, let's talk about reading the entire contents of a file using the files class. So the files class provides a static method named readAllLines to read the contents of a file as lines of text. The readAllLines method comes in two variants. And so the general signatures is either readAllLines where we can pass in a path, or readAllLines where we pass in a path, file path, and then as the second parameter, the character set that you want to read those lines as. And again, it's going to return back a list that uses that generic parameter typing of string, of data type string. And again, both methods may throw an IO exception. That's true for all these methods we've really been looking at, but in particular, usually we're looking at stream methods, input streams and output streams. Here, we're using the files method. And these are static methods. So we can call this from the files class itself. We don't have to instantiate an instance of file, right? So why don't we take a look at this example, right? So let's create a Java program to read the whole contents of a file using that read all lines method from the files class. Again, this is going to be our source code here, but let's go ahead and just jump to IntelliJ, and we'll open up our read file tester 4. This is the fourth example in this presentation, fourth way of reading a file that we're actually going to examine the source code to. So again, in read file 4.txt, if we look at the contents of our file, it's going to have multiple lines, a first line, a second line, a third line, and fourth line. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to import for this this code. We're going to import our IO exception. We're going to import from a couple different things here. We're going to import a character set, right, using the standard char sets from the NIO package, the new input output package. And here we're also going to import the files class from the new input output package, the NIO package. And we're also going to get that paths class. And then from our java.util package, where we want collections, we want to get an iterator, and we want to go ahead and get a list. Excellent. So now let's create a class that that's going to have a main method, but we're also going to create a helper method here. So let's take a look at the helper method. Our helper method is going to return back a list. We're going to call it readLine, and it's going to take in a string which represents the file name. So then what we're going to do is from collections, we're going to invoke this method empty list, which is going to return back a list instance. And then we will bind that list instance. Now notice this is a static method inside of collections. So we can call it from class scope. We don't need an actual instance. We don't need an object to invoke that. And so it will return back to me a list instance, an empty list. Then I'm going to do this try catch block. I'm going to try to go ahead and do this IO, right? I try to read the lines of a file, that create an exception if the file doesn't exist or whatnot. So here on the files method, so again, this is a static method, just like this was a static method. So we can get this from the files class itself. We will invoke the read all lines, and we got to pass it in the first parameter, a path instance. So from the paths class is a static method get, where we can pass in that string that represents the file name, and that will return a path instance, a path object for that location in the file system. And then here for standard char sets that we imported in, we will use the UTF_H. So we're just going to use the second. Now that's the default encoding. So I didn't have to do the second parameter, but I'm just showing you what it looks like to use the second parameter. So what's going to return here is going to be a list of strings. And so what we're going to do is we're going to override our empty list with this new list that gets returned back. So I'm overriding, I'm writing over the empty list. And so if some exception occurs, then we'll just print the exception. But if it doesn't occur, then we will go ahead and just return the list of all the lines, the strings that we read from that file. Then inside my main method here, I'm going to invoke that helper method. I'm going to pass in the path of the file I'm going to read. So that's read file4.txt. That's this one right here. It's going to use this method call to get a list of all the strings in there and all the lines in there. So it's going to read all those lines and save it into a collection. It's going to return that collection. I'm going to save that collection here. And then I'm going to ask that list for an iterator. And I'm going to save the iterator into an iterator instance. And while iterator has a next element, I will grab that next element and I will print it out. And let me run this so we can actually see that we can go ahead and then print out all the contents of that list, which is the collection of lines inside that file. So that's just another way that we could read a text file that we haven't seen before. And then the last way I want to see how we can read a text file as a string. So let's create a Java program to read a text file as string. And so in this program, we'll use the read all bytes method of files class. And so the read all bytes method of the files class reads the contents of a file as bytes. So the general format of it looks like this: read all bytes. It's static, so I can call it from the class itself. I can pass it just a path because there's no char set. Char set is if we're translating to characters, but this is bytes. So what I end up returning back is an array of bytes. So this method ensures that the file is closed when all bytes have read or an IO error will occur. So very simple. Let me get rid of some of these superfluous lines here. Okay, perfect. And again, let's take a look at this. Let's close out this other example. This is going to be the last example. Read file tester 5 and read file 5 txt. So looking at the file we want to read, it's going to say this is the first line on the first line, and then it's going to say this is the second line on the second line. So let's take a look at the source code then. I'm going to import the files class from the NIO package, the NIO package, from the file, and inside of the NIO package is the file package. I'm going to get the files class, and I'm also going to get the paths class from that same package, from the file package. Okay, then the next thing what I want to do here is separate this, make it a little bit easier to read. Perfect. Then I'm going to create a class, read file tester 5. This is the 5th actual example we're looking at to actually execute for reading a file. Here, I'm going to create a helper method that I'm going to call in my main method. So let's see what it's going to do. I'm going to create a method, read file to static method. So I can, I don't need built instances. I'm going to pass in the string that represents the file name. I'm going to return back the string, which is the contents of the file. So here, the file contents as a string is going to start as an empty string. And then what I'm going to do is from files, I will read all the bytes. And then recall that requires a path instance as a parameter. So from the paths class, there was a static method called get, where I can pass in a string that represents a file name along with the file path, and it returns back a path instance. So that path instance will be supplied as an argument to the files method called to read all bytes, and that's going to return back all the bytes to the file, where I can pass all those bytes into the string constructor. So I can say new string and pass in the bytes there from the bytes array. Maybe what I might do here so that we can see this is we can have our bytes array. Why don't we do this? Perfect. I guess I shouldn't type that in correctly. Okay. And then I'll pass in my bytes there. And then I'll go ahead, pass the bytes into the constructor to string. And so that's going to convert all our bytes into text, into our file content, and then we'll return that to the invoking function. So our invoking function is the main function here. So here we're going to call that helper function that we just defined, read file. We're going to pass it in that file name, read file 5, to get all the contents as a single string, and then we'll print out that string. And if we run this, we could see that we get the one string, but we were able to read the new line characters and everything, so it actually renders as multiple lines, but it's all just one string. Excellent. And so that's just a quick overview of the multitude of ways that we could potentially read the text from a file using various input streams or reader classes, using the file class, or using the scanner class. Lots of different options. And I leave it to you to decide what works best.